Hi everyone, and welcome to our QCE English exam revision lecture for the ATAR Notes September lecture series. My name is Jess, but before I get into a little bit more about me, I want to introduce ATAR Notes for those of you who aren't familiar with us. So we started back in 2007 and since then have been offering lots of high school resources for students. And the lecture series is just one part of that. The lecture series has been going since 2015 and is part of our commitment to offering free resources for students. But we also have lots of other offerings as well. And if you're not familiar with some of these, then here are some examples. We have online Q&As, videos, articles, ATAR calculators, and newsletters. And we also have study notes as well. You may have heard of things like Ed Unlimited, and that can be really handy when it comes to your external English exam. We've got all sorts of different books that are going to cover the different texts that you may be doing your external exam on. And I made use of those myself when I was in year 12 studying for my external, so I highly recommend those as well. You'll be able to have overviews of the text, understand the characters and the themes, look at quotes and analysis of quotes, and find quote banks and things like that, as well as just general advice and tips that you can take on board to make sure that you do as well as you possibly can. So without further ado, let me introduce a little bit more about myself. So as I mentioned, my name's Jess. I graduated back in 2020 and I'm currently studying communication and journalism at the University of Queensland. I'm in my third year of that 4-year dual degree. And I got a year 12 English score of 99. And I love reading and writing, so English was one of my favorite subjects. And the other subjects that I did were all humanities based, your business and accounting and legal studies and ancient history. So hopefully I can share today a little bit of my love for English and help you out with your external exam. So let's have a look at what we'll be covering today. First of all, we'll have a bit of an overview of the QCAA. Then we'll look at essay writing step by step so you really understand that process you should be going through. We'll have a look at some preparation basics when it comes to preparing for your exam, and then some study techniques and general kind of exam advice that I'm sure you are looking for. So let's get into it. The QCAA is our first section. So back in 2019, the QCAA actually conducted some trial exams to get a sense of how students performed in these external exam conditions. And they had a few key findings that are going to provide a bit of guidance for you as well. So students with a clear and consistent thesis always did the best. Your thesis is that overarching point you're making, that overarching argument that you're then going to work towards showing throughout the rest of your essay. It is the backbone of the essay, so without that in your introduction, you don't really have a clear sense of direction for the rest of what you're writing. Your 3 body paragraphs are based on that thesis. They are sort of sub-points underneath that thesis that are working towards showing why the thesis is correct to begin with. Your essay is providing all of that analysis and that evidence to back up the thesis, and then you're drawing those conclusions at the end of your piece. Students need to demonstrate a deep understanding of the whole text. So don't make the mistake of only including your knowledge of one part of the text. And of course, you need to read the whole text. So some students don't read the text at all, which is definitely a recipe for disaster. and it's best to read it not only once, but also twice or even 3 times if possible. The more, the better, because the first time that you read a text, you are just getting your understanding of what's actually happening. You're familiarizing yourself with the plot and the characters and the general idea. And it won't be really until the second reading where you can really get that deep understanding of the themes, the ideas that are getting put across to you, and you can start thinking about possible questions you could be asked. You can be finding quotes that align with those things, and you'll have that understanding behind you already from your first reading to make that process a whole lot easier on that second read through. And then, in terms of just understanding of the whole text, you don't want to be just choosing quotes from the very start of the text, for example, because neglecting the whole end of the text or the middle of the text is showing that it's suggesting to markers that you have a limited understanding, and that may not actually be true. You want to demonstrate your full understanding. Part of this as well is making sure that you choose quotes that are not just the most famous ones. So oftentimes a text is going to have those quotes that they're really well known for and things like that. And while it's good to know those quotes, they generally are going to be famous for a reason. They're going to have some kind of meaning behind them that will be useful for an exam like this one. You still want other diverse, versatile kind of quotes that can show the depth of your understanding and that kind of thing as well. So be wide when you're looking at your evidence and showing your understanding of the text. Students need to be constantly referring to audience positioning and drawing on cultural attitudes, values, and beliefs. So, how is the audience made to think or feel based on what is written in the text? So, think about the time period and how that impacts on those things. And you'll be drawing on those attitudes, values, and beliefs. What did they believe in that time, and how did they impact the way that they would react to the text? What did they value? What were their attitudes based on different things? So you can think about all those themes that you can draw from a text, themes about femininity and masculinity, or power or control, violence, things like that. They all are going to reflect those values and beliefs of the society, and you can draw ideas from those to figure out how the audience would be positioned. Okay, so the QCAA, this website is your friend. So it's going to give you a really strong indication of what the QCAA is looking for. And it also has resources to aid you in your preparation. So if you want to understand more about the kind of terminology that is used, so you want to understand what cultural assumptions, attitudes, values, and beliefs are, you can see those sorts of explanations in the glossary section, and you can see the way that you'll be marked, what markers are looking for. Now, while the syllabus doesn't outline exact details for the external exam in terms of a marking rubric, it can still give you a good indication of the sort of things that you'll be looking for. There are lots of connections between different pieces of assessment for English when it comes to the marking criteria. You'll see that things like the analyzing the cultural assumptions, attitudes, values, and beliefs, looking at those concepts and times and places, looking at perspectives and representations. They are all common things that are required across the different pieces of assessment. So keeping those things in mind for your external exam too will be really handy. Okay, essay writing. So let's get stuck into how you actually write a good essay. So responding to an unseen question is something that's quite daunting for a lot of students. And one of the most common questions we would get is, how am I supposed to write a full, articulate essay based on a question I haven't seen? So this can seem pretty overwhelming, but there's a sequence that you can go through to make it easier. So what do you want from your question? You want to determine what type of question it is, and we'll go through those different essay question types. What exactly it's asking you, so really checking to make sure you're understanding the full meaning of the prompt so you can then respond directly to it. You are aiming for direct relevance, because if you're not responding to the prompt, regardless of how good your essay is, you won't be able to do well. Then you're looking at any specific details you'll need to include. So you've got things like your limiting words, your scope words in those prompts that outline the specifics of what you need to be looking at. And then ultimately, you need a thesis. You need to draw from the prompt and develop that thesis that you can then refer to and use as the backbone of your essay. Okay, so as I mentioned, we're going to go through some of the question types, and you can break these up into different categories. Here we've got 5 different types. We've got character type, the theme type, aesthetic features, relationships between characters, and then author's intent. Some of these will sometimes be overlapping. Oftentimes you'll be looking at themes, for example, and you still have to factor in different characters in relation to those themes, for example. But these are the 5 ways that predominantly we can classify our questions. So let's break these down and have a look at each in turn. So relationships. Analyze the effect of Mr. Rochester's manipulation on the character of Jane in Jane Eyre. So this is that example of relationship between 2 characters. They're asking for an effect of one character on another. It could be worded in a bunch of different ways. It could directly say, what is the relationship? Analyze the relationship between characters. It could be one character's effect on the other. It could be the role of one character in making another character do something in particular or think in a certain way, for example. So this is all about those character connections, the relationships between the characters in the text. Next up, we have aesthetic features. Now, we may not really understand exactly what these are, but it's a pretty wide kind of term. So it can include all of your figurative language, similes, metaphors, personification, things like that. And it can include a whole range of other different types of strategies as well. So thinking widely about aesthetic features is the best strategy. And you can have a look at what aesthetic features are, some examples of that. Also in the syllabus, you can check out the definition there with some examples. In this case, we've got to what end does the storm scenes in King Lear reflect the tortured state of Britain? So this idea of the sort of representation of this idea and representing the tortured state of Britain. So you would be using your aesthetic features to pull apart this prompt and respond to it. Themes. Now, this is one of the most common question types about those concepts and themes that are in a text. How is the American dream's disfiguration represented in The Great Gatsby? So we've got this idea of the American dream, we've got this idea of disfiguration, and you're going to have lots of themes in all of your texts. So again, it could be that idea of gender, it could be power and ambition, it could be violence, it could be blood or the nighttime, the evil of night, good and evil. Even animals as well often are used in that symbolic kind of sense in these sorts of texts that you will be studying. So these questions are all about that kind of thing. And they can be worded in lots of different ways. It can be, how is this represented? It can be, what is suggested about this? It could just be directly analyze the role of this in the text. You also have those questions that are based on giving a statement as though something is a fact, and then asking to what extent do you agree with this as well. So not only are there different question types in terms of the focus of the content, so themes, characters, etc., there are also different sort of formats of how the question can be asked as well. Character question type. So this is similar in a way to our relationship type, except it's focusing on a particular character instead of the relationship between characters. And in this case, we've got, how is Kurtz a metonym for imperialism in Conrad's Heart of Darkness? So this is about a particular character and their role in the text. But you can see that it actually has some overlap with that idea of the themes as well, a thematic kind of question, because you've got this idea of imperialism as well, and even looking at that idea of a metonym as well, you're bringing in some other question types too here. Author's intent. So regardless of the kind of question that you get, you will pretty much always be looking at what the author is intending and the strategies that they use and things like that. But you can have particular questions that are worded in a way that's about the author's intent. So Shakespeare posits that King Lear is primarily responsible for his family's destruction. To what extent do you agree? So this is that other question type that I mentioned before, where you have to take a position on a statement of fact that you are provided with. So here, what makes this author's intent is it obviously includes mention of the author and what they were intending to do, what their strategy was when writing the text originally. Okay, so some ideas about those key language elements as well. You've got the idea of how, and this can be used for any of your different question types that we just went through. So it's asking you to unpack the question exactly as it sounds. How are readers positioned? How is the symbol used? How does Hamlet manipulate the character Ophelia? So that is a pretty sort of straightforward idea. We're pretty familiar with being asked that kind of how question. To what extent, on the other hand, may be a little bit more uncommon, for a little bit less familiar to you. It is also linked to all different question types, and it's asking you to agree or disagree or partially agree or partially disagree on the statement that you are given. So usually it's going to state something as fact, and you need to you need to take that position on that. And it's about your opinion, and then it's about being able to back up that opinion as well with your evidence. And you need to include the measurement kind of word in your thesis to indicate that idea of to what extent you need to respond directly to that with that sort of level of agreement, if you will. Analyze, of course, it is an analytical essay. So analyze is a pretty common word that we'll see in external exam questions. And you can think of this as being used in the same way as the idea of examine or discuss. You need to be looking at something in detail and picking it apart. So oftentimes these they're written as a statement. It's not an actual question. So that's why we often call essay questions prompts, because they're not actually all necessarily questions. And so they're requesting you to do a very specific thing. They're giving you that topic that you specifically need to focus on and pick apart. Perspective is another word, and it's linked to audience positioning questions. That idea of how the audience is positioned to think or feel or react based on the content of the text, the strategies used, and the language used. So questions with this word are often asking you to either side with or argue against a particular message that's communicated by the author. So this is pretty clearly related to that idea of that author intent, and then the sort of impact of that intent. Okay, so in terms of steps, when it comes to getting this unseen question, where do you actually go from there? It may feel overwhelming to begin with, but if you break it down into these steps, it can feel a lot more manageable. So what I recommend to begin with is highlighting. So highlight all the important details of the question. And if you don't want to highlight, then you can also use other equivalent strategies, underlining, circling, whatever is best for you. And when you're doing this, you need to determine what the question type is, what the question is asking you, and what you'll actually be discussing in your essay. So in this case, we can see in this example question, it's a how question. We are looking at social class and this idea of the concept of social class. So it's about how the reader is invited to view that concept. So you need to be focusing on this theme. It's a thematic question, and it's also that audience positioning kind of question as well. And oftentimes you're going to have limiting scope kind of words as well. So sometimes you may be asked to look at how a character's relationship with another character, and it may specify that you need to be looking at their relationship to another male character, for example. And that's that limiting kind of word, because it's determining that kind of scope. You can't be looking at a female character, you have to be looking at a male character. So look out for those limiting words and the specific words that are telling you what you need to focus on. The good thing about the questions or the prompts is oftentimes they're using that language that you then need to use yourself as well. So a good strategy to make sure your thesis is on target is to use that same wording as the original prompt. Now, throughout your entire essay, you don't want to only be using that word throughout. So if the question is about the extent to which you agree that Lady Macbeth is evil, then you wouldn't want to constantly be using the word evil, but you want to be looking at synonyms and using words with that same meaning. Wicked and all that kind of thing that's going to show that same idea, but then also illustrate that you have that breadth in your vocabulary. And if you need to reword the question, then you can do it in this step as well. So sometimes, for example, you may be given a prompt kind of style that's not written as a question at all. And some students do prefer to have that question format. So you can change it up a little bit to reword it into that question format instead. So instead of analyze the concept of social class in Jane Eyre, you could then transform it into how is the reader invited to view this concept, or some equivalent of that. Usually you can change those analyze kind of questions into how or what questions. And that can be really helpful for some students to actually understand what they need to be answering, what they're actually responding to as well. Okay, so step 2, it's about writing down some notes. So note down everything that comes to mind about the concept that is in the question or the prompt. And at this stage, it's just broad. You're thinking about everything that you can think of based on your knowledge. And we've got an example based on this same question here. Jane doesn't fit in a class, so in a turmoil. The hierarchy was very important, and Jane experiences both settings, lower and upper social class. Upper class people portrayed as rude, unfeeling, harsh, cruel, ignorant. And we've got some ideas of particular scenes that illustrate those points we're making. Lower class people are often nicer, and in this case have a connection to God, near impossible to move between classes. So putting down all the different ideas, and these can help form what your points will be, or just the different analysis that you may have within each of those points. So then you're going to group those ideas and draft a thesis. So gather all those ideas into groups and look at those ones that are the strongest and make the most sense for the particular prompt you've been given. So while you're starting off broader, this is where you're narrowing it down a little bit more. You want to be able to write a messy, or what we call sometimes an ugly thesis, based on this. So an ugly thesis is that idea of just a rough draft of a thesis. And it may not be perfect, it may not be the one that you end up using, but it's giving you that general idea of the direction that your essay is going to be going in. An example, Bronte highlights the rigid nature of social class to explore the negative effects it has on the individual. So again, taking those ideas that we've come up with, grouping them together, and coming up with that draft thesis. The final step is to take that thesis and refine it into something really clear and concise. It's important to remember that your thesis needs to be understandable, or your essay is going to suffer. If you don't understand your thesis and how to integrate it throughout your essay, it's going to be a real struggle to write it. And it'll also be a struggle for anyone trying to read it as well, which is definitely not what you want. So a final thesis here. Bronte exploits the traditional notions of social class to expose it as a burden of individual growth and progress. So you can see we've got that same sort of line of thinking that we had in our original draft thesis, but we've refined our language and we've thought more deeply about that original idea as well. So something to keep in mind here is ultimately that you don't need to get it perfect to begin with. Don't get bogged down with trying to come up with something that's just right from the outset. You can take some time to do a bit of a draft to get yourself into it and organize your mind with all of your ideas. Okay, so we've got an example here from Hamlet. How is the reader invited to view the concept of morality or conscience in Hamlet? So we've got this idea of a how question. We've got the concept of morality or conscience, and or is a key word here as well. So how, concept, morality, concept, conscience. And or is key here because it's not asking for both. And these kind of subtleties can make a huge difference when it comes to an essay prompt. Sometimes it's going to say something like and therefore you need to make sure you're doing both things that it's outlining. Sometimes it will say or, and you've got to make sure you're choosing one. Otherwise, you will be trying to squish in two ideas into your essay, and you probably won't be adequately exploring the ideas in order to do as well as you could do if you chose one and fully focused on that one idea. Okay, so once we've broken apart the prompt with some highlighting or underlining or circling, you can then come up with all of those ideas that come to mind when it comes to that particular prompt. Here we've got Hamlet seeks revenge for his father's murder. Immoral actions lead to further immorality. Two moral systems in that time, pagan revenge and Christian mercy. Hamlet's quest for revenge causes the death of others. So sometimes you're looking at points that are related to the sort of social system, the way things worked back in that time. Sometimes you are writing down events. Sometimes you're looking at meanings and ideas that the author might be putting across. That idea of immoral actions lead to further immorality is an example of that. And then Hamlet shows mercy when he finds Claudius alone in prayer. That's an example of an event that could be directly relevant as an example in response to this kind of prompt. So once you have all of those points down, you've got your ideas on paper, you can then think about your thesis and developing that thesis. So here we've got seeking revenge leads to the degradation of morality. So going after revenge is just going to make morality further away than it otherwise would be. And then we want to reformat that into our full thesis. So here we are changing it so it's about the author's intent and what he is wanting the reader to get from the text. Because remember, the question was about how the reader is invited to view the concept. So here we've got the Shakespeare poses to the reader that revenge is in itself immoral and that justice and retribution should be left to God. So we've got here something that is refining that idea we had before. So we had this before to begin with, and this is us broadening that, putting it into that full format and fleshing it out more. And you can see that we have chosen immorality as our concept. We aren't speaking about conscience. So this is where you've chosen just one because that is what the prompt asked of you. Okay, so the thesis. This is something that we're speaking about a lot, but I assure you that is for good reason. It's going to be really hard to go anywhere with an essay or to get any kind of credit for what you write if you don't have that strong thesis. So it's the most important sentence in your essay, and it needs to be clear and concise. So, as I mentioned earlier, a really good strategy is using words from the question to demonstrate to the markers that you're directly addressing what is actually asked of you. If you try and complicate it by making it completely different, using other words, it is going to be less clear and perhaps is going to lead you astray as well, maybe lead you off track from where you actually need to be and what you need to be talking about. It's going to be helpful for you and helpful for the marker to have that clear link. And it's a bit of a tightrope as well because you need to be broad enough to be referring back to this thesis throughout your paragraphs. Usually you're going to have your 3 body paragraphs, but it needs to be niche enough that you're delivering some kind of solid point with some kind of value behind it. So don't make the mistake of making your thesis narrow in such a way that it doesn't actually encompass all 3 points that you'll then make. Those points that you'll make in the body paragraph are sub-points that fall under the umbrella of that thesis. They're holding that thesis up. So you may have 3 ideas. Perhaps you're looking at the role of women in a text, and you're going to have 3 characters that you'll focus on, 1 for each of your 3 paragraphs. So your thesis shouldn't just be talking about 1 or 2 of those characters and then excluding the other 1 or 2 characters. You need to be making it broad to encompass all 3 characters, or just making it so broad that you don't actually refer specifically to the character names, but talk about that idea of the role of women generally and leave those specific characters that you'll be exploring to the signposting that you may do in your introduction to outline your points. And then, of course, the body paragraphs themselves as well. So typically a thesis is going to be 1 sentence, and sometimes it will be the last sentence in your introduction, and you'll have before that your first sentence where you provide some context, where you provide the information about who the author is, what the text is, and the general idea that you'll be talking about in the essay. Then you can have your signposting and then your thesis, or you can do those last 2 steps the other way around, have your first sentence, then your thesis, and then your signposting. That is something that is up to your personal preference, and it's also about the way that you've been taught and also what your teacher may prefer as well. It can be handy to get their advice when it comes to that too. So the process of producing a solid thesis is going to naturally be really closely linked to actually just answering the question. But there are a few other details that we'll go through as well, because as it is the case for most things, it's easier said than done. Okay, so we've got a theme-based question here. What is the role of family in Jane Eyre? So step 1, jot down all the ideas about family in the text. We've got the idea that Jane is orphaned. She grew up with her aunt and cousins. Mr. R has a ward. And we've got this idea of marriage as well. So jotting down all the different ideas that you have. And this is how you can be spending that planning time that you'll have at the start of your exam. Remember, you've got 15 minutes of dedicated planning time to be using wisely, and this is that process that you can go through as soon as you're able to start the exam. And then the idea of step 2 is picking the one that appeals to you the most. So you will have had a bunch of ideas that you will have developed, and you need to go with one of those ideas. You need to establish what direction you'll be taking in your essay. Step 3, try and put it into a sentence. And this is you establishing that thesis. It can be just the general kind of draft thesis instead of needing to make it perfect to begin with. So the generally you're going to have that first sentence which will outline the author and the name of the text, and oftentimes the thesis will be a separate sentence that will have any measurement words if they are required for prompts that are asking you to take a position whether something is to a certain extent that you agree with it. Use words from the question as well, and it depends. Sometimes the thesis may benefit from directly referring to the author as well. If you need to say Shakespeare's intent was this to have this impact on the audience, it would make sense to mention his name in the thesis itself and not just that first introductory sentence of the entire essay. Okay, so Charlotte Bronte manipulates the theme of family in order to influence readers to understand its power over the individual. Bronte's manipulation of Mr. Rochester's romantic relationships demonstrates to readers the acute influence family has on the individual in Jane Eyre. So you can see how we are taking those ideas that we brainstormed and we're refining them into that sentence format. We've chosen those ideas that we want to focus on. Coming up with that broad list to begin with is a good idea because it gives you that content to work with. Then you've got that choice of what works best, what you feel you have the most to say about, and then you can go from there in terms of forming that thesis. Remember, it's ultimately about showing what your argument is. What is the point that you're going to then try to show throughout the rest of your essay? Okay, so when it comes to dropping marks in analytical essays, it's actually usually not the ideas that students have that let them down. It's oftentimes actually the planning that lets students down. So don't underestimate the importance of having a good plan to set up your direction for your essay. A lot of students fail to establish and maintain that synthesis throughout their piece, having that flow and that cohesion so it all works together in a really well-ordered way and makes that point really clear as a result. So failing to plan is just part of this problem with this lack of synthesis in the essays. So let's have a closer look at using your planning time effectively. As I mentioned earlier, you do have 15 minutes of planning time. You can't be writing on your actual exam paper yet, so you can be using this time to be figuring out what you'll say. So when it does come to that 2 hours of writing time, you'll be able to get stuck into it as soon as possible. Something to keep in mind with planning time as well and the planning that you do is it needs to be understandable to you. You're not being marked on your planning, and so it's about making sure that you do planning that makes sense to you, that you can then use to inform what you write. And it's not about making it neat and pretty and understandable to others. Keep that in mind as well. And not only that, but you can therefore use strategies that your make your planning a little bit quicker. So, for example, instead of writing the full name of a character who may be saying a quote, you can use just a few letters as like an acronym for that instead. Okay, so how to use this 15 minutes of planning then? You want to start by reading and unpacking the questions. So you'll be given 2 prompts. Regardless of what text you will have studied, you will have 2 prompts to be choosing from. So first of all, of course, you have to choose which prompt to go with. And then you can start that process of reading and unpacking that particular prompt. You'll look at what type it is, indicated by those words like what, how, analyze, to what extent, and then what it's asking. Look at the particular words it provides in terms of characters, in terms of relationships between characters, themes, the intent of the author, the effect on the reader, any particular aesthetic features you're being asked to look at. And yes, what elements need to be included based on what the question is actually asking you to do. Formulate that draft thesis based on your prior knowledge of the text. So you will have come up with the different notes that you can think of, and you can then form your thesis based on that. And remembering, it can just be that basic idea. Sometimes we struggle to think of those exact words that we want, but if you just get yourself started, just write a draft that doesn't have to be the final product, that can set you on that path to at least making a start. Step 3, refining the thesis to produce that final version. And this can include altering that language. So maybe you're making it sound more sophisticated, maybe you're adding more detail, maybe you are being more sort of analytical in your description of something. So there's a few different ways that you can be improving it from the original. Then once you've got your thesis, you need to think, how am I going to back this up? You've got to have those 3 points based on the thesis. Usually it's going to be 3 paragraphs, and that's definitely what I would recommend rather than 2 or 4. And it needs to be based on the thesis. So like I said before, the thesis is the umbrella, and these points come underneath that to hold it up. And make sure that these points are not repetitive. You want to have individual ideas and just one idea as well. It would be really complicated to be trying to explore a whole bunch of different things all in one paragraph. So aim to have one idea per paragraph and 3 ideas in total, and make it so they're clearly linked to one another and the thesis as a whole. So for each point, you can write a topic sentence outlining what that paragraph will be about, and this shouldn't include a whole bunch of analysis. This is just that outline of what the paragraph will be about. Then you can have your evidence that you'll use to support your particular point and the overarching thesis, and any connectors as well between the different ideas that you've developed. And you can write all of these points down in your planning time underneath each of your ideas for your 3 paragraphs. Use all 15 minutes. So write as much detail on the page as you can. And if you don't end up using it all, then that's okay. And if you need more time to complete a full plan, you can go into your writing time. So yes, you are given 15 minutes of planning time, but that is not a maximum. It's not a restriction on what you do. The only rule here is that you can't be writing in that 15 minutes on the actual exam paper. But you can go over 15 minutes with your plan, and it is worth it to ensure that you have your logic and your reasoning organized in your mind before you get started. That can prevent any confusion you might have later. It can really set you up so you've got that clear direction and can just get stuck straight into it. And this is going to depend on your style as well. Some students find that they can just have a broad idea, they can have a thesis, and then basically get stuck into writing an essay based on that and a few general ideas for paragraphs. Other students may have to go through this full process of thinking about topic sentences, specific evidence, specific analytical points. So this is where it's really valuable to work towards actually understanding yourself, what is best for you and the way that you work. And the way to do that is doing practice exams, which I cannot recommend enough. And you can start off, if you are really unfamiliar with this kind of essay writing style, you're not confident with it yet, you can start off with just writing essays in general without those sort of exam conditions to add to what you have to think about. So starting off with just refining those skills, and then you can go towards actually sitting some practice exams in those exam conditions to reflect what it will be like on the day. And that is going to give you that practice. So when the day does come, you feel more confident with what to expect, what to do with timing as well. You want to know how far through your essay you should be at particular points in the exam time frame, and that can keep you accountable to make sure you're progressing okay in the exam. So a full plan is worth around 80% of the final product you write in the exam room. So investing some time and energy into getting really good at them is going to serve you really well in the long run. And in terms of when you do those practice exams, don't neglect actually having that practice exam planning time too. Don't just go straight into you're doing the 2 hours of actual writing. Have that 15 minutes as well. And to add to that, you can actually just do practice planning. So sometimes you may not have the time to be able to be doing lots of different full essays, but it's a lot easier to fit 15 minutes into your schedule than it is 2 hours and 15 minutes. So if you can, just doing some practice planning sessions, little 15-minute blocks here and there that are allowing you to break down a prompt and plan how you would approach it in an essay. Okay, so the all-important essay structure. When it comes to introduction writing, we've touched on this a little bit, but let's go into a little bit more detail. So first of all, introducing the text, and you're going to include the author and a brief phrase or synopsis. So you don't want to have a big recount of what happens in the text. and you want to avoid a few different things as well. Don't be tempted to praise the author or praise the text. It doesn't actually add any value for you to be saying what a famous and great author they are, how amazing the text is and well acclaimed and things like that. That is not showing any analysis or adding really any value to what you've actually been asked to do in the prompt. So that first sentence is about who wrote it, what is it called, and what can you tell us that's a broad kind of statement about it that's relevant to provide some kind of context. So, for example, if you are writing about, I'll go back to that example about Lady Macbeth being evil. Maybe you could mention something about how the Elizabethan era, when it was based, had specific kind of gender expectations for women as opposed to men. And that is providing some kind of relevant commentary, because then your essay could be about the portrayal of Lady Macbeth as being evil and how she rejected those gender norms that were the standard in that time. So the thing about this first sentence is you don't want it to be saying the exact same thing as what you'll later say in your thesis. It's more about that background, something that's going to set you up for what you say in the following sentences. The next part, narrow the focus to indicate the topic of your essay. So this is sort of an optional sentence because it depends on your topic and the way you're approaching it. You may have already done this narrowing down in your first sentence, or if you want to be drawing it out a little bit more, if maybe it's more complicated, then you could need this second sentence to provide that that narrowing down and that focus on your topic. Now, as I mentioned earlier, you can have different orders for these last bits. Some students and teachers prefer to have the thesis at the end of the introduction, and some prefer having it before the preview kind of section. So the thesis is that argument, that central message that you'll be referring back to throughout the essay. And the preview, on the other hand, which is also sometimes called signposting, is the brief summary of your points. So this can be one sentence, it can be two sentences, it can be three sentences, one for each of your points, but you shouldn't be introducing evidence. You shouldn't be analyzing things and talking about what things show and what things indicate, and things like that. So make sure that these points that you provide are purely an outline and don't go into a lot of detail for this. Your introduction should be in that realm of about 100 to 120 words or so for a 1,000 word essay, and you don't therefore have a lot of room to go into a great deal of depth here. That is reserved for the body paragraphs. And that signposting can be done first and then your thesis, or you can do it in the order that we've got displayed here. Okay, so let's have a look at some examples to paint the picture in our minds. To what extent are Jane's views shaped by the characters around her? So our first sentence, in the novel Jane Eyre, Charlotte Bronte challenges Jane's desire for autonomy through various characters who desire to impose their views upon her. Okay, so we're clearly showing what we're talking about. We've got the name of the text, we've got the name of the author, and we're making that broad statement that covers the subject of the essay. So ultimately, think about what the essay is about. No sentence in your essay should actually be really generic and unrelated. That's why this idea of praising the author or talking about how well renowned the text isn't actually relevant, because that is not going to be the topic of your prompt or your question. So even this first sentence from the very outset, you still need to be actually relating to what the prompt is about. You're covering the subject of the essay, not anything unrelated or anything that is generic. Okay, so we've got this introduction is giving a clear sense of the essay's argument or interpretation, and it's offering an overview of the body paragraph's focus. So let's have a look at what comes after that first sentence. Helen is motivated to convince Jane that her true purpose in life is to trust in God and his ability to provide a joyous afterlife. Conversely, St. John presents a clinical and sacrificial representation of religious belief, so severe that he becomes almost inhuman. Ultimately, however, Mr. Rochester inspires an unbridled passion in Jane and seduces her into sacrificing her independence for love. So it's not strictly required that you provide that overview of each of your body paragraphs, provide that idea of the signposting or the preview, but it can be really helpful for a few reasons. It can allow you to really understand what it is that you are going to focus on in your body paragraphs. If you establish that from the beginning in your introduction, you've got that clear sense of direction for how to form your body paragraphs, your topic sentences for those, and what you'll be focusing on. And it can also help the reader as well, because it does provide that really clear kind of clarity around your direction and your ideas. And so basically, you know what to expect when writing, and your marker knows what to expect when reading. Here in this example, we can see that clear idea of signposting because we have got the mention of 3 characters. Oftentimes when we've got a thematic kind of quote, so this idea of Jane's views, we can then divide that up in our paragraphs according to different characters. So here it makes a lot of sense to be dividing up the essay with 3 different characters to focus on. And we've done that clearly in this introduction. We've got Helen, we've got St. John, and we've got Mr. Rochester. And you're focusing here on how each of those characters have shaped her views. So a really clear link between the question and the response in the introduction. Another example. Discuss the ways in which Shakespeare's Hamlet explores uncomfortable truths. Okay, so let's have a look at this introduction. Immediately, we've got this idea of William Shakespeare's revenge tragedy, Hamlet. So we've already established who the author is and what the text is that we're talking about. And this is then where we go into something relevant, some kind of relevant commentary about the play. So in this case, presents to its audience a confronting exploration of the disparities of a decaying world. Now, this is clearly related to that idea of uncomfortable truths, but we haven't gotten to our thesis yet. It's still establishing, setting the scene in that first sentence. So though shaped by Shakespeare's socio-political Elizabethan context, Hamlet has been appreciated across centuries due to its compassionate evaluation of uncomfortable truths in human behavior, misogyny, the inquisitive human temperament, and the meaning of life itself. So this is the idea that you are providing, again, more context here. So not always necessary to provide lots of exploration, but in this case, it has been deemed necessary by the writer. And these are universally engaging elements have been reinterpreted by critics and audiences over several centuries, since reality is in the reader's mind, thus ultimately facilitating the textual integrity of Hamlet. So definitely not always required, but you can actually include academic quotes to enhance your argument, but don't let them do all the talking for you. Don't let them overtake your analysis and your ideas. So it's important to use the keywords from the prompt, as I've mentioned, to ensure we can see that relationship between what you're writing and what you are asked to respond to. So in this case, we have got those keywords. Uncomfortable truths is really clearly stated here. And this provides a bit of a quick summary of the play. So in terms of retelling the story, that is not something you should be doing in an essay at all, whether it's in the introduction or elsewhere. It's not about retelling, it's about analyzing. And you can add some more plot context as you analyze the play in your body paragraphs. When you introduce your different points, you'll be giving some context to those different points, different quotes, different pieces of evidence. Okay, so now that we've had a look at our introduction paragraph, we're now going to have a look at the body. So your body paragraphs are going to be, of course, the largest part of your essay, and this is where you get into your evidence and your analysis. It shouldn't be appearing in the introduction or the conclusion. So your topic sentences need to indicate what you'll be arguing in each paragraph, and they also act as those connectors between paragraphs as well. So you have that sense of cohesion, that idea of synthesis that I mentioned earlier. So through the use of this particular aesthetic feature, the author demonstrates this. That is an example of how you can approach this idea of a topic sentence. So your body paragraph structure, you've got the thesis, so the position on the argument, and you've got your evidence. It could be in the form of key quotes, structural devices, aesthetic features, different events that occur that you can use to illustrate your points. You've got your analysis of that evidence. So remember that there's no point in just providing a whole bunch of quotes, a whole bunch of ideas, if you're not actually going to pick apart those things. It's up to you to show the reader why your points are relevant, why your evidence is relevant. So you need to be showing how or why it proves your thesis and your point for that paragraph. You're relating to the point in the paragraph and you're relating to the overall thesis. So the thinking that unpacks the evidence to prove that thesis, that's what your analysis ultimately is. And then audience positioning, how the elements are prompting the audience to think, feel, or react. Make sure you're thinking about the context of the text that you're looking at when it comes to audience positioning. That's going to determine their values, their beliefs, attitudes, assumptions, etc. So we can call these body paragraphs the meat of the essay. They're the big part in the center. And when you're writing these, each of the elements are plugged into this recurring flow. The what, which is the evidence. The so what does it mean? Why should we care? That is what the evidence means. So how does the audience get positioned by that point that you're making, that evidence that you're providing? And so now is that link back to the thesis, which you should constantly be doing to make sure you stay on track and make it really clear the relevance of what you're saying. Okay, so what does this look like in an actual essay? So a bit of a micro flow here in the context of this particular Heart of Darkness text by Joseph Conrad. So what? Something like an emissionary of light, something like a sort of, and so we've got a quote there, and then we can look at so what? What does it mean? Why does the audience need to care about your mention of this quote in terms of what it means to what you're trying to say? So, by characterizing imperialists as emissionaries, Conrad depicts them to be peaceful and civilized, language associated far more with politics than the forceful acquisition of land. Further, light, in the context of imperialism, connotes the bringing of education, civility, and refined culture to a land of what Marlowe describes to be impenetrable darkness. So this depicts imperialists as agents of God, not only aligning them with the qualities of honor, respect, peace, and righteousness, but Conrad also grants them with the holy justification given to the Crusaders in the Holy War. You can see that we are really picking apart what it means, what the author intended by including these ideas, and that's really adding to the evidence. If you only provided the evidence, it would be totally leaving the audience in the dark, wondering what that means. So you need to direct your audience's thinking, the reader's thinking, so they can understand the relevance of the evidence that you include and your thought process. No one else is inside your head, so you need to share your thinking with everyone else. So how? So we've got the conservative and patriotic traditional audience of the novella, this rendering of imperialism would be familiar, positioning them to be shocked as Conrad dismantles this view. So you can see again here how it's about the context of the time. We have different beliefs, attitudes, values, assumptions these days than they would have done back when the texts that you'll be studying are written. So you want to be thinking about the context in which they were written and how those audiences would have been positioned to think, feel, and react. And here we're also making that really clear by referring to the audience and who they actually are. So now is our link back to our thesis. Through establishing the upstanding traditional view of imperialism, Conrad positions the novella to destroy this interpretation with greater impact. So that is an example of how you can be using that flow of ideas, plugging in your ideas to that flow to make it work in terms of structure really clearly. And this factors into that idea of synthesis that we mentioned earlier is often a problem for students. Okay, so analysis. Don't just slam dunk your evidence into your essay and then stick a couple of page numbers there and leave it. So you need to contextualize your evidence. by looking at where it occurs in relation to the wider story, perhaps who is speaking and who they are speaking to. Otherwise, we really have no idea what is happening. The context can actually provide some significant insights for us to actually understand why you've chosen that evidence, why it relates to the thesis. So here we've got an example. Prior to the king's ghost appearing on the battlements, Prince Hamlet laments that, and then introducing that quote. Following the failed marriage ceremony, Jane confronts Mr. Rochester. So sometimes it makes a huge difference when it's occurring. And of course, we always need to know who's speaking, because if we aren't sure who's speaking, then how are we supposed to really know what's happening? If you're looking at characters, it's a character prompt. We need to know who is speaking to who. If it's a theme kind of prompt, it's the same idea. We need to know what person, what character is related to that theme. So making it really clear for the audience is what you'll be able to achieve by ensuring you've got that context when you're introducing your quotes. Sometimes it's going to be part of the same sentence, like it is in these examples, where you provide the context and then the quote in the latter half of the sentence. Other times you may need more context than that. You may have a full sentence with context, and then you may have a little bit further context in the second sentence before then introducing the quote. So it is okay to slightly alter the grammar of a quote to allow it to fit nicely into your sentence. Oftentimes things like the tense of the sentence, or whether it's plural or singular, you may need to change things like that. The pronouns that may be used, you'll be talking about characters in third person, not using words like I or me. And so you may need to change words like that if they appear in quotes that you want to use. So if you need to change a word, a suffix, or a prefix, then use square brackets to indicate the change. So you may have a word like demand, for example, or demanded. So say it's demand, maybe you want to add ed to it, and in which case you can put that ed in brackets to show that it wasn't part of the original, but that you added it yourself. So you can't analyze any words or phrases that don't appear in the original text. That may seem self-explanatory, but it is really important that you're not making things up out of desperation for content to be speaking about. So make sure you don't fall down that rabbit hole. And also, in terms of altering quotes, you can't be changing the meaning of the quote when you add your square brackets. So be sure to use that in a responsible kind of way. And the other way that you can be altering your quotes is putting an ellipsis in, which is a ... 3 periods, and that is going to indicate when you've removed words. So perhaps you've got a long quote and you want to only use part of it, you can remove words and show that with an ellipsis. Okay, so digging into this idea of meaning, which is the basis of an analytical essay, you're analyzing meaning. So the first step, try the sweet potato rule. So why did the author choose this instead of sweet potato? And next, keep an eye out for aesthetic features and structural features that the author may have used in the text. And always consider things like characterization, relationship dynamics, audience cultural context, and the wider story, and how these things affect the meaning of evidence. So things like the cultural context, for example, if you're looking at gender in a time from all those centuries ago, they had very different beliefs and norms and structures in society with how things worked, the role of women and men, and understanding how those things impact the meaning of evidence is really important. So, just to give an example as well, you often have this idea of night and darkness in texts like those Shakespeare kind of texts. And to us, we think darkness, night, maybe we think of that as a literal thing. If you take night, for example, we just simply think of sleeping and night, whereas oftentimes you'll see that kind of idea repeated in texts like Macbeth because of that cultural context, because of the beliefs of the people in that time. They believed that night was a time when evil things would happen, when evil would come out and commit those atrocities. So making sure you understand that can then inform the way that you understand the evidence and analyze the evidence to support your points and your thesis. So here, the language chosen by Conrad connotes adventure, gold and fame, both invoking images of success and glory within the reader's mind. The imagery of chain of diamonds suggests that Jane is a slave in her relationship, destined to serve her husband as his subordinate, not his wife. The world is a nightmare acts as a metaphor to highlight the evil and cruelty that plagues the main character, his outburst suggesting he is close to breaking point. Again, if we go back to our previous point, this is looking at relationship dynamics. For example, that second one between husband and wife. It's looking at cultural context. It's looking at characterization as well, and those different strategies that are being used to get different meanings across. So how does your analysis position your audience? How do they feel in response to what you've covered? Do they agree or do they disagree with your position? Do they feel shocked, disgusted? Do they approve of the actions of the character and the direction of the plot, or do they disagree? So some key kind of terms, phrases that you can be using to make sure you're integrating your audience positioning are things like this. As a result, audiences are positioned. So you will have done your analysis and now you're drawing those conclusions about how the audience would respond or feel. Thus, audiences are prompted to respond with and then provide the emotion that they are responding with. Remember, you need to be considering how their traditional culture would prompt them to respond. Again, having that background knowledge of a text's context is important. So hopefully you will have done that before even really learning about the text. Hopefully you will have learned a little bit about the time period to understand the beliefs of those people and how society worked. And that is going to help you when it comes to this idea here as well with audience positioning. So, mind mapping with a bit of a note-taking guide. It can be handy for anyone who is a visual person to map out different ideas as well. And it can only be really simple or it can be more detailed. It depends on the way that you work and what works best for you. So you can map out your different ideas and break them up into different sub ideas and this can help you formulate what you have as your plan for your essay. So for example, here we've got the different themes that we are drawing out of a central kind of idea. You could be using this strategy for a character as well and looking at, for example, different character connections. You could be looking at the role of a character in a play, thinking about how the character relates to different themes. So there's a variety of different ways that you can use this mind mapping kind of technique. So let's have a look at some examples now of body paragraphs. So discuss the ways in which Shakespeare's Hamlet explores uncomfortable truths, our same question from earlier. Now, to begin with, we've got human curiosity is a universal trait. That is, though in Shakespeare's Hamlet, it is shown to unearth various inconvenient truths. So this topic sentence is directly responding to the question. We've got that idea of truths again, but you can see how we've brought in a synonym already. We're not repeating the idea of uncomfortable. We're actually using the word inconvenient instead to show that variety of vocabulary too. And we are going to explore this theme in this paragraph. It's clearly showing what the paragraph is about as well. The meta-theatrical nature of Hamlet allows for the immediate investigation into such behavior as the play begins in media res. So here we've got meta language. We are showing that we understand the text's structural features and what sort of strategies have been used. So in media res is something that you may have come across before in creative writing. Oftentimes we're told to start a short story in media res, which basically means in the middle of things. You want to be starting in the middle of the action rather than at some boring part of the action where the character is getting out of bed in the morning, for example. This contrived chaos is exacerbated with Bernardo's rhetorical dialogue, "Who's there?", which cleverly foreshadows the motivitic diseased disorder within the rotten state of Denmark. So we're not only providing some evidence, we're also looking at the actual strategies that have been used. We're saying about foreshadowing, we're saying about rhetorical dialogue, and then what does it actually do? This cleverly foreshadows the diseased disorder. And then we've got so that's a really clear transition between quotes and analysis. And then finally, we've got this idea of Hamlet's first soliloquy further exposes his innermost thoughts while presenting an insight. And so it will then continue on from there. And we're looking here at furthering what we've already said. So continuing on from this, with which audiences can empathize. So we are relating to audience positioning by mentioning how they would respond to something from the text. His frequent negation, nay, not so much, not to, demonstrates his internal anguish. Again, those analytical verbs, demonstrates, foreshadows, all of those words that basically mean shows. I keep saying that you should be showing why your thesis is correct. You should be backing that up. And so all of these analytical verbs are picking apart the evidence that is going to then ultimately support the thesis. And you also can have these subtle references to things. So frequent negation. So you're identifying that it's a repetitive kind of thing. You're identifying that strategy that has been used, and that is showing your knowledge. And you're looking beyond, in this paragraph, you're looking beyond language techniques as well. So the difficulty of determining truth with an ambiguous society is carefully constructed within all of Hamlet's soliloquies. And we've got some quotes there to finish off as well. And we finish with that idea of thus. The integral characters of Hamlet create a metafictional dimension that allows audiences to appreciate the value of humanity empathetically. So using words like thus and hence and things like that is usually a really good strategy to use in your concluding sentences, because it actually shows that you are drawing a conclusion. Thus, based on what I've said, this is the case. You're drawing something out of what you've previously said to actually bring the audience to your conclusion. A second example, and this goes back to the first idea we looked at earlier, with to what extent are Jane's views shaped by the characters around her. So, through the character of Helen, Bronte presents the unrelenting faith that people have for God. Helen is a character that does not express resentment towards others, vowing instead to love your enemies. She holds no animosity towards Miss Scatcherd, despite the constant abuse she inflicts on her, instead blaming herself, insisting she dislikes her cast of character. And then we've got these ideas of our analytical verbs here. Directly juxtaposes Jane's bold hatred. So this comparison is highlighting the difference between Jane and other characters, and we've got a quote there to actually back up that point. And we've also got the idea of the strategies that have been used. This idea of juxtaposes, we're identifying that juxtaposition has been used as well. And we can see here how square brackets have been used to make the quotes flow, because oftentimes your text is going to be having those first person pronouns, and we want those third person ones instead, with her and he and they, instead of I and me and you. And this is the end of the paragraph as well. And we can see how we finish off again. Helen is described as a character who strives to do good and hears Jane patiently to the end. So all of these words that you can identify throughout, condemns and all that kind of idea, they are your analytical verbs that you want to be using. Okay, so of course, there's always lots of emphasis put on the introduction because of the importance of establishing your thesis. And then lots of emphasis is also put on the body paragraphs because it makes up the bulk of your essay. But don't neglect your conclusion when it comes to essay writing. So it wraps up your essay, but it doesn't add any new information. So don't make the mistake of adding new ideas, new evidence into your conclusion, because it's about bringing it all together, what you've already said, and showing why your thesis is correct, drawing an actual conclusion based on all of the content that you've covered. You should have actually gotten somewhere with it. There should have been a purpose to analyzing all of that stuff. So restating your thesis and as a definitive statement to indicate that you've really shown the validity behind your thesis. Restating your points and indicating how they work together to prove your thesis. And you can use your topic sentences as references to see what you have covered previously. The thing here to note is it's important not to be really repetitive. You want to be adding to what you've already said, not just repeating things that you've already said. So keep that in mind as well. And to conclude, make a general statement about how key themes in the text ultimately shape the way an audience views a text. And this needs to be more general than just your thesis. And so, for example, if you were studying Heart of Darkness, you could discuss how the novella is a critic of imperialism and how it challenged the conservative views of its audience. Ultimately, it's about drawing a conclusion, and again, using words like thus and hence is sometimes helpful. Using the name of the author as well to discuss what their intention was and things like that is also helpful. And you'll often see the word ultimately come up too. That's a bit of a theme as well. So discuss the way in which Shakespeare's Hamlet explores uncomfortable truths is our question again. We've got ultimately the definition of human nature allows Shakespeare's Hamlet to be appreciated in distinctive ways across differing, and however you pronounce that word, I'm not even sure about that one, so I think I won't attempt it. So the conclusion has to have a few purposes. You have to summarize your arguments, reiterate your contention, and leave that final impression on your marker to show your understanding of everything that you've been exploring. So that word is the defining mood of a particular historical period shaped by the prominent ideas and beliefs. So you can be using different words that are sort of specific to essay writing in the context that you may not use in your everyday language. So, for example, you could be talking about foil characters, and we may not usually hear about those, but foil characters are those characters that are sort of the opposite of one of the other main characters to show that sort of juxtaposition with the differences between them. And we've actually got a quote in this case to finish off, and that is not a requirement, but it is something that you can do. Just don't let them do all the work for you. Sometimes it can be just safer to avoid ending a paragraph with a quote from the text or elsewhere, because this would allow you to put your point in your own words, which has its certain strength and shows your own understanding of the text. You can see as well how we're using the name Shakespeare. Shakespeare's challenging but invaluable reflection of humanity. So using again that author name to really talk about his intent or her intent. Okay, and our one about Jane Eyre. So Charlotte Bronte's Jane Eyre highlights the battle required for Jane to gain and maintain her independence. The religious beliefs of Helen are imposed upon Jane, who teaches her the worth of putting faith in God. Conversely, St. John desires to manipulate Jane into doing his bidding, to enslaving her as his wife. Mr. Rochester causes Jane to contemplate abandoning her autonomy for love, though she is ultimately able to find a balance between all those conflicting elements of her life and becomes an independent woman despite all odds. So giving that overview again of the points that you've made and drawing those conclusions based on the things that you've looked at. And you can see some repetition of key things, but not word for word things that are just plopped back in, copied and pasted. So for example, we are talking about the author again and the name of the text again. It is important in your conclusion to make sure that it's directly related to the text itself. The conclusions that you draw are about the text, not about general ideas. So some common mistakes that we'll go over now. Synthesis, as I mentioned earlier, and oftentimes this is what's going to let you down. So make sure you're constantly referring to your thesis, and that is going to keep you on track. Assuming. So many students leave gaps in their work by not stating the obvious or not really outlining their interpretations and their thoughts on evidence and ideas from the text. So remember that you are the only person in your own head with your own way of thinking. You can't assume that other people are going to make the same connections as you. They could have a whole different interpretation, and that is going to lead to a lot of confusion for the reader when it comes to understanding your intended meaning and the analysis that you were trying to perform on the text. So spell it out for the reader so you aren't forcing them to do any extra work, because ultimately you're not going to get credit for that when you're being marked. Spelling and grammar. Now, exam conditions make spelling and grammar a little bit trickier than it would be when we've got all the time in the world to be checking over our work. But it's important to be editing and reviewing, even despite the time constraints that you're in, because a big part of your mark here is just the quality of your writing. So there are different approaches that you could be taking when it comes to editing. You could be, if you're the type of person who can finish before the end of the exam, perhaps you just want to get it all out on the page and then leave that time at the end to go over and check for any mistakes you may have made along the way. Alternatively, you may be more like me, where I would never have any time to spare at the end of exams, and I would actually review and refine and edit as I wrote. So I would make sure I was happy with each part that I wrote and make sure that it was grammatically correct. The spelling was there, and even just the way that you're referring to characters. You want to make sure you're talking about the right person at the right time. You haven't accidentally messed up the name somewhere. You have used the correct kind of terminology for the time period and things like that. So not murder, but regicide, for example, when you're talking about murdering a member of the royal family. So those are the sorts of things that come into play when it comes to editing, and doing your practice tasks is the best way to figure out what way is best for you for editing. You probably already have a little bit of experience as well with understanding how you go in those exam conditions with timing and things like that. Okay, so some preparation basics. We've got some resources that can be really handy, some strategies that can be handy to help you in your writing. So annotating your text is really important in analytical pieces. So as you're going through the text, it's important to keep notes, and you can have different strategies for annotations. If you own the book yourself, then you can be annotating in any way you like. You could be highlighting, writing notes along the sides in the margins. you could be circling things and all that kind of stuff. But if you don't own the text, then you will be more limited with that. So you can have things like sticky notes instead that you can put into your text to write your notes on instead. And I also highly recommend trying to see if you can find a digital copy, because that can be handy when it comes to searching for particular things. Maybe you know the general kind of wording of a quote but can't quite think of it and you want to find it, so you can type in some keywords in the search function by control Fing, and that will get you to find those things more quickly. It can just be a real time saver to have that digital copy. And if you do have to borrow the text, then having that digital copy will allow you the opportunity to digitally highlight and annotate your text as well, since you can't do that in your physical copy. So it's going to be pretty obvious to markers that you have a solid knowledge of the text, or if you don't have that solid knowledge. And so read the book all the way through, or read the text, in fact, all the way through, and then make notes as you go. And it's going to save time later on, so you don't have to revisit everything and go through all those thought processes all over again. Every time you have an idea or a thought, you can be writing that down. And it doesn't even have to be just analysis. It can be, you can be signposting a question. You could be thinking, what does this mean? What does this show? Or you can be putting analytical points. You could be writing a note about the connection between different events or different characters. You could be writing a note about aesthetic features, foreshadowing, key symbols that are repeated throughout. All those sorts of things can come into play with annotations. So you can be spending all sorts of time with going through your text. So as I mentioned earlier, read it more than once. You can be annotating on your first read through, or you can just save your first read through for purely understanding the text, and the second read through can be for doing those annotations, digging deeper. Or you can do annotations in both. Maybe the annotations in your first read through will be questions and sort of general ideas that come to mind. And the second read through, you maybe will be able to build on that. You'll be able to put in more analytical points. You'll be able to more easily identify where the foreshadowing is, because you will have known what actually comes after that as well. So give yourself the best chance by knowing your text and picking it apart as you go. So as I mentioned, sticky notes can be a really good resource as well, and you can just use them to identify recurring ideas as well, themes or characters and stuff like that. You can also have a key of some sort. You could be doing color coding, or you could be using symbols as well. So an exclamation mark for things that are important, a question mark for things that you're unsure about in terms of their meaning. You could have an arrow or something like that to represent links between ideas. So coming up with a system that makes sense for you is a great idea. And again, it doesn't have to make sense to other people. It's about you and what works for you. So don't use one color, use multiple colors and assign each color to a specific purpose. If all you're doing is highlighting in the same color, then you're limiting the meaning that that highlighting can actually have. So you could be showing different colors for keywords, for the main character's development, for different themes or structural features, And this means that when you are looking through what you have done in terms of annotations and highlighting, it'll have a lot more meaning. You'll have that instant recognition and won't even have to read through the content to be able to see where different pieces are. So maybe then when you're studying later on, you can be skimming through pages and be looking for a particular color without needing to read word for word what each of your highlighted parts actually is. Okay, so having some kind of bank of quotes is something that I cannot recommend enough. So this is something that I did myself in Year 12 to prepare for my external exam. I had a quote bank with themes across the top and a column down one side with the different quotes. So I was able to, for every time that the quote related to one of those themes, I would highlight that corresponding box in the table to show that that quote related to that theme. I would write notes in that box to talk about how the quote related to the theme. And I would have other information as well. I would include what the act and scene was of the play. I would include who was speaking and who they were speaking to. So that idea of having that context as well, because as I mentioned earlier, you need to bring in the context in your essay to provide that understanding for the reader. And then having the actual analysis kind of notes as well. What does it mean? How does it relate to other things? What does it show about the author's intent or audience positioning? Those things are all things that you can work out in your quote bank to make it as valuable as possible. And ultimately, the idea of memorizing quotes is one of the most daunting parts of this external exam. We think it's an unseen question. We don't know what it actually will be. So how are we supposed to come up with that strategy for memorizing targeted, relevant quotes? So find evidence as you go and do this with some kind of quote book. So you can be setting up a table in a Word document or a Google Doc, or you could have a physical book where you write your quotes. And of course, the benefit of having the digital copy is that you can copy and paste, and you can also have that search function in those documents as well. If you do go for the book option, the physical book option, make sure you've got some kind of system to organize it well. And any kind of notes that you have in class can help inform these kind of quote records as well. You're likely going to be unpacking evidence in class, and those things can be added to your quote book as well. And you can go through this incrementally, this quote book, to be learning the quotes as the term progresses. That means that when exam time comes, it won't be all so overwhelming. So practice writing your thesis. I mentioned earlier that you can be doing little parts at a time. So you don't have to be practicing a full essay every time you do practices. You can have little sessions dedicated just to 15 minutes of planning time practice. You can be having little sessions where you're writing a good thesis for a whole bunch of different prompts. And so having that practice is something that is really important, and especially with the thesis, since it is that most important part of your essay. And you can access practice questions on the QCAA website. You've got the exams from previous years. You've got sample exams. And I'm sure you will have accumulated some practice questions from class. You can find those sorts of questions online as well. There's lots of resources out there. And also, you can create your own questions too, your own prompts. So oftentimes, for example, when we explain a concept to someone else, it actually really enhances our understanding of that concept because we're trying to think about how to make it clear for that person. It's a bit the same way when it comes to writing your own questions. You have to really think about how to formulate the question, the wording to use, and that can enhance your understanding as well. And of course, that is beneficial when it comes to then being able to write a really strong essay. So some study techniques and external exam advice. So some key words, some vocabulary for essay writing. You've got words that indicate addition, words that indicate sequence. So I encourage you to go through these kinds of words to see how you can link ideas together, how you can be using those sentence structures that are varied and that are clearly articulating your points. You want to use variation, you want to show connections between things, and you want to vary your vocabulary in a way that's showing the breadth of your knowledge. You've got consequence and contrast as well. Things like however and whereas are key things that you'll be using all the time. Shows, which is a really big one in terms of your analytical verbs, and causes as well, because you're analyzing what does it mean? What does this demonstrate? What does it confirm or explain or foreshadow or juxtapose? So shows is one of those really simple words, and there's lots of other words that you can use instead that are higher level vocabulary. Okay, so some memorization strategies. You may learn better and may memorize better if you're in that social kind of situation where you want noise and company and other peers of yours that might be trying to analyze and memorize as well. Others, if you're like me, are better in a quiet environment. So try and figure out what works for you. Logical or mathematical. So some people are better with typing and some are better at handwriting when it comes to words and thinking about memorization of those words. So you can figure out again what works for you in that case. Associate words or phrases with movements. That can be a helpful thing in a physical kind of sense with memorization. So the different actions that happen in a play, you can associate those actions with the words, and that can help you remember. Similarly, you've got verbal and visual. So in terms of verbal, instead of just saying the words out loud, repeat every other word and then go back and forth with a partner. You can be recording quotes and listening through, earphones whenever you've got spare time to quotes. That can help you remember that passive listening style. And visual, write words on mirrors or windows, stick them on the door or in the car. You can use pictures to represent the quotes as well, and that can spark your memory. And in terms of visual and verbal as well, you can create creative things like social media posts or things like that that are related to a quote or related to an idea in the text. And that can help you remember as well. So, a few key tips to finish off. Have 3 achievable goals a day. It's easy to have really high expectations of ourselves, but it's far more beneficial to have a few key goals that are achievable within that 24-hour kind of period. And that way you can feel good about yourself, you can feel like you're making progress, and you can reward yourself as you go. Have breaks as well. Have one day of the week free of study. So, for example, Sunday may be your day off, and you need to have that time in order to avoid burnout, in order to have that balance in your life. Enough time to sleep and to look after your health. So recognize your emotional boundaries. So pushing yourself when you aren't able to really function well is not going to be effective, and it's going to lead to just being burnt out. As I mentioned, taking care of your physical health. You need to be taking care of yourself in order to then do well. Set goals and celebrate completing them. The celebration is a good part, and you can be celebrating in lots of different ways. It doesn't have to be a party. It can just be, it can be something a lot quieter if that's what you would prefer. But celebrating those little wins is a good way of rewarding yourself. And then breaking it down as well, making things really a lot simpler so you don't feel so overwhelmed. Keeping things in diaries and calendars to organize your thoughts and make it so when you go to bed at night, you don't have lots of things going through your mind that you can't get out. So, also just thinking about mental health, finding a good place to work and having hydration and food and having breaks, all those things are really important when it comes to studying and having that balance in life. So keep that in mind as well as you work towards your external exams. Thank you so much, everyone, for coming along today. I hope that that has been helpful. Good luck with your external English exam and as well all of your other exams and beyond. Good luck.